Hey, welcome to Cultivated Live for Wednesday, May 15th. My name is Jay Rosenthal. I am the co-founder of Cultivated Media, the host of this program, Cultivated Live. And we have a great guest today, Aaron Ghitelman. And we have, of course, my co-founder, Jeremy Berke, Cultivated's editor-in-chief. And we're going to get to these two in a second. But just a little bit of background. Since we launched, our goal at Cultivated has been to be cannabis industry first, providing you with the most important, insightful, useful, and timely information every day. We do that through our daily newsletter, Cultivated Daily. We do that through this daily live stream, Cultivated Live. So if you would, follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to us on YouTube, and importantly, or most importantly, get our newsletter in your inbox every day. How to do that is in the link below. And we'll get to what Aaron's doing here, which is going to be great. As many of you who follow the cannabis industry closely know, Aaron is the former communications director at the Office of Cannabis Management in New York. You can find him at Ghitelman. I'm going to see if I can point to it. Ghitelman, at Ghitelman on X. And you'll want to follow him there because he's got lots to say. Jeremy, you can find on X as well as LinkedIn. But let's all of us, if we can, let's get to what's driving the news. And then we're going to get to our conversation with Jeremy and Aaron. Delaware, while I was putting this together this morning, my kid said Delaware, which I thought was a funny joke. So I thought I would give all of you the dad joke that my kids came up with. But yesterday, of course, they legalized cannabis last year in April. Until then, it was one of the few non-legal holdouts in the broader Northeast, aside from Pennsylvania and New Hampshire. But yesterday, we got a first look at the proposed rules for the state's cannabis industry. It was all on Delaware Public Media. You can find a link to it on cultivated.news. The regulations outline the requirements for licensing, packaging, and inspection standards. They also outline the state's social equity licensing program, which applies to those convicted of cannabis-related crimes or have lived in an area disproportionately impacted by policing and the war on drugs for 5 of the last 10 years. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The regulations will be open for public comment until June 3rd, which is not that long from now, and are set to be finalized by July 30th. And then the next step is the state's Office of Marijuana Commissioner says it's on track to award retail licenses by March 2025. So things happening in Delaware, a relatively small state. Jeremy, Aaron, have you seen what's going on there? Is this of interest to people on the Atlantic coast, mid-Atlantic? It seems like
it's of interest to people in the sense that it's a new market in the Northeast. I think it's a small state. It does fill in the Eastern Seaboard in quite a satisfying way, I think, on the map when you color it in. But other than that, I think, at this stage in 2024, new states that aren't very big states like Florida or Ohio are a little bit less interesting. While important for Delaware residents, a little less interesting to us in the industry.
I'm just curious if the regs will allow for dispensary at that rest stop on 95. One of my rest stops on 95, made ample drives from New York to DC, stopped there for many breaks and snacks. So we'll see if they add a dispensary there too.
I would like to see an ad where a dispensary is the closest dispensary to Joe Biden's actual home. I think that would be a pretty cool moniker. The Biden dispensary within 1 mile of his home. That would be kind of cool because we did have someone on from DC. There are certainly I-71 dispensaries in DC close to the White House, and probably some medical ones in and around DC too. But that would be an interesting moniker for that dispensary. So we'll keep our eye on Delaware. We're also keeping our eye on New Hampshire this week. We expect something to happen in the Senate. It might be good or semi-good, like it actually passes the franchise model and goes back to the House side of the legislature. One interesting note, it came up yesterday. The House in New Hampshire has like 400 something seats. The Senate has 25. I don't know if there's a bigger and smaller legislative body in the country next to each other, but it does make for interesting politics in New Hampshire on top of also interesting politics. So we're keeping our eye on that. And Aaron, let's get to you because whatever we're going to talk to you about is probably more interesting than, no offense to New Hampshire or Delaware, but sort of sitting on that news. Welcome. Why don't, before we sort of jump in, give us a little bit of your background and what brought you to today.
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Aaron Ghitelman. I'm the former Deputy Communications Director for New York State's Office of Cannabis Management. So my background has been kind of in politics, nonprofit, communications, right out of college, spent about a half decade running communications for a voter registration organization that registers people to vote at concerts and music festivals. Headcount. While there, I helped launch the Cannabis Voter Project, then kind of worked at a startup, worked at New York City census outreach efforts, worked for a New York State senator, and then got connected with OCM and worked there for 2 years. And on top of all the other stuff was a whole lot of cannabis consumption. And in college, more than just consumption, and just kind of a deep love for the feeling it gives me, deep love for the plant, deep respect for everybody up and down the supply chain when it was legacy, now that it's legal, and just, I think, a reverence for this. And I'm a born and raised New Yorker, born and raised in the Bronx. And like the idea of being able to bring something I love so much and kind of not me like single-handedly bringing it, and also it was already there, but to help shape what a legal market for the next century might look like was, I don't know, an opportunity of a lifetime. And even though there were a lot of speed bumps and really tough days, and not everything went as planned. I think that's why I'm here chatting right now. It was the honor of a lifetime and just truly beautiful. And the people who make up New York's supply chain, the cultivators, the processors, the dispensary operators, the bud tenders, are incredible, wonderful, beautiful people who I am here to support and uplift however I can.
So let's jump into it. I think I'll take 30 seconds and kind of set the stage for why we're talking right now. We're about 3 years into legalization in New York, right? Things have ramped up in the last few months, but I think the process has been slower and bumpier than everyone expected and everyone wanted, right? I think that's pretty fair to say.
I will note that New York got its first dispensary open faster than Massachusetts.
That is true.
Stores open faster than a bunch of states. And I think kind of like, I would say New York's probably in the middle of the pack when you compare it to, say, the Virginias versus, say, the Missouris. And here to chat more about that. But want to push back about the concept of slowness. And I think my quick take there is New Yorkers are impatient people. The countdown clock did not start when the MRTA was signed in 2021. The countdown clock started on Election Day in 2012 when Colorado and Washington did it. Because at the end of the day, New York, we don't like coming in second or third. So I think for us, it's wait, if this is a thing somewhere, why is it not here?
That's a fair point. I think anyone who has read my tweets, much to their misfortune, or the newsletter, probably to their fortune, they can kind of get a sense what my perspective is, right? And I'm going to use that term perspective loosely because I want to maintain some journalistic integrity here, right? But it's to look out for consumers, right? Like I myself am a consumer. My friends are consumers. My friends, themselves were always wondering, what was taking so long? Is this dispensary legal? Is it not? I saw that in Toronto, the city I'm from, like it was the same growing pains. I don't want to say New York is unique in that example, but what New York has tried to do with its cannabis program, I would say to its credit, many others disagree, was very unique in terms of centering social equity in the letter of the law and in the beginning of the industry, right? Like that was a very deliberate thing they did. I think it was a good thing, but I think, the execution left something to be desired. So, the reason why we're talking today is that there was a report, a month-long review into the OCM. The report came out on Friday. The director of the OCM, Chris Alexander, is set to step down at the end of his term in September. There have been some other sort of high-level departures from the organization, including yourself, Aaron. And so why don't we just start there? Like, could you talk a little bit about your time at the office, both some of your wins and maybe some of the things that frustrated you in your job in particular?
I'll start with the wins.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I think is very important to note is that New York State has tripled the number of Black owned and operated and majority Black owned dispensaries in the nation. I believe MJ Biz Daily shared a report at the beginning of 2023. There were something like 12 or 15 Black owned dispensaries in the country. New York alone doubled that number in its first year and a half. I think kind of that in and of itself is huge. I think when it comes to, and I think I want to center kind of what is success around consumer focus, a little more than kind of operator focus, because in every market there are winners and there are losers. And I think from a consumer standpoint, we have a greater diversity and array of products than any other state did at this level of maturity. And I think, to me, the product that like I put on, and they're not paying me, but that I put on like the kind of top shelf of, wow, this is New York cannabis, is the heirloom infused apple cider beverage. And it's made with apples from their farm and cannabis from their farm. And it's just like, this is what you can get when you license more cultivators, when it's not just 5, 10, 15 folks focused solely on indoors. No shade on indoors. Indoor cannabis is great, as I'm sure a lot of people watching are aware of. But that when you like bring in more people, you get a greater diversity and a greater array of products. I mean, Jenny's came to market very quickly with a kosher product, which I know really meant a lot to a lot of my kosher friends. And then I think when it comes to pricing, so when Jeremy J, I'm going to do a little pop quiz. When the vertically integrated operators opened in New Jersey and Illinois, what were they charging for their cheapest eighth?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, but I do remember it being more expensive than New York. I mean,
it was around 55 to 65. And in New Jersey, you're still seeing prices hover around that. And in New York, when the first vertically integrated operator opened, I believe it was either December or early January of this year or December of last year, they were selling $25 eighths. And I'm sure there's some cultivators listening or dispensaries listening who are like, well, we can't compete with that. And I'm sure they are. I can't guarantee they're being a loss leader, but I think it's very, very important to kind of note that what New York did, and it's not just equity. And I think equity is an important aspect in kind of, or let me rephrase that. It's not just equity in the sense of prioritizing certain applicants. That is one part of equity. But I think the secret sauce to what New York did, which allows for the greater diversity of product, which allows for the cheaper prices at this stage in the market, is because of the two-tiered market, because of antitrust. The best learnings from the late 19th, early 20th century, from the alcohol market, and saying, hey, we're making real competition. Nobody gets to kind of buy this market and act like a cartel like we've seen in Illinois, like we see in New Jersey. And I think that, to me, is kind of the big thing. Granted, I can sometimes delve into policy wonkery, history wonkery, so stop me if I'm boring people. But I think kind of when you look at competition, New York has created what is truly the most competitive market in the country and will continue to be. All right, now for frustrations. I mean, like, I wish I had a full list of it. I think it's I think the biggest frustration in New York is the Dormatory Authority of the state of New York, which some refer to as a gubernatorial slush fund, is an agency, and this isn't like new. This isn't unique to Kathy Hochul. This is something that Andrew Cuomo utilized, George Pataki utilized, Mario Cuomo utilized. Like, it's not new. But the Dormatory Authority was tasked with overseeing a fund that was supposed to build out, and they promised 150 pre-built dispensaries for justice-involved licensees to kind of move in with a turnkey operation. And I think and this was supposed to be completed by, I don't know, mid-2023, and I think we're at about 12. And I think essentially the entire premise of the CARD program, the Conditional Adult Use Retail Dispensary Justice Involved Equity Program, hinged around these dispensaries getting built. In fact, when they applied, they were told they were not allowed to bring their own locations. And like, I remember June 2022, colleagues of mine yelling at the top of their lungs, being like, this is impractical. If they haven't gotten funding yet, and they haven't signed leases yet, these store builds will not be ready in the timeline they are promising. And people went to the governor's office and Dormitory Authority and said, what they are talking about is a pipe dream that is unfeasible and will screw over these licensees. And what we were told was, stop being bad partners. The Dormitory Authority needs people who can bring their own locations to be part of this program, or else they won't be able to find funding. And I think, to their credit, they were people who I think genuinely wanted to help, who didn't realize the massive thing they bit off. I mean, they literally told Ashley at the New York Times, we didn't anticipate it would be this hard, which is wild because they were they were tasked to do this because we knew it was this hard for people to find locations and build out compliant locations. But essentially, and then lo and behold, they didn't actually get the funding until significantly after they would have needed to build it out. Eventually, OCM was like, hey, literally every single piece of flower is going to rot if we do not let people bring their own. We did that. The governor's office signed off on it. Then immediately when that release goes out announcing that people could bring their own locations, we get furious calls from the governor's office saying, why are you sandbagging the Dormatory Authority? And we were like, wait. We literally, this is incredible. I don't know if you can foil, if highlights come through in foils or if they would share it, but we literally, Freeman Clopo literally highlighted the section about this announcement for the governor's office that they signed off and approved. And then that occurs and immediately we get told nobody from OCM can do interviews and that was about a 10-week holding period. And sometimes they would say no interviews. Sometimes it was, hey, run it by us. But if you know how kind of TV interviews work, sometimes you have a several-week lead time or a week lead time or a day lead time. But these are people who have a job to do. They're asking, they need a 3-hour turnaround. And if you need to go through 7 people in a communications office and 15 lawyers, you're not getting a 3-hour turnaround. Other frustrations, I mean, I think that itself was the linchpin that led to certain actions, which were then challenged in court. I think like disappointment, but not shock to bring it back to history. I recently read a book about the foundation of the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, FDR, and they existed for about 8 years before they could actually regulate securities or exchanges. So Joe Kennedy, JFK's dad, was the first, I think, chair of that agency. He sets it up, leaves after 8 months, goes on one of his like classic 4-month European vacations, and gets a letter from another member of the board saying, Joe, you're missing out on all the fun. We get sued every 5 minutes. And then it was like, oh, this isn't unique to OCM. Anytime a new government entity seeks to put out regulations that did not exist in the past, large operators, and it's well within their power to do so, organize grassroots or astroturfed campaigns to kind of yell that this is bad. They throw whatever they can in the legal arena to kind of slow it down and muck it up. And I think at the end of the day, like, with that context, not a shock that lawsuits slowed it down, no matter how airtight things were written. And I think in retrospect, things weren't written perfectly airtight. There are going to be lawsuits. And when you go to the courts, you're really rolling the dice.
So I want to keep this like 30,000 foot view enough for those who aren't as familiar with like the inner workings of Albany, right? But, you know, I do think, you know, the point was raised to me when we put out the newsletter on Monday, which I think is a good point, is that DASNY should absolutely not be escaping scrutiny in this, right? And I think you raised that point effectively. What I do want to talk about, though, is, you know, your specific portfolio communications, right? You know, a lot of the you know, this is not your specific job, right? You were doing a lot of external stuff with journalists, but a lot of the card licensees say they weren't communicated with. You know, we've discussed the point that, you know, these licenses, for lack of a better term, can be a crapshoot, card license or otherwise. A lot of people were sort of relying on that. You know, maybe it's, you know, their own fault in some respects, or maybe they were communicated with poorly. So I want to sort of understand, you know, why, from your perspective, there was that sort of communication gap.
Totally. So I think I want to clarify, my role was Deputy Communications Director overseeing press. So I was not tasked with communicating with licensees. The communication with licensees often comes from licensing itself. And I think I think one of the issues was there was a TRO or injunction that literally prevented the office from communicating with card licensees for 4 months, and 4 months when they are sweating. I don't think when it comes to card licensees, this is not their fault. The state presented a program, literally used the phrasing, this is an opportunity to acquire generational wealth. And these are people who literally just listened to what the state promised. And I think the fact that the state did not deliver the built out storefronts And the ones that they did deliver have kind of rent loads that are so large they might not be profitable is a deep shame. I don't know if I would say, I mean, scandal might be an appropriate word to use when it comes to kind of what these card licensees went through. But I guess the kind of, let me take a step back about kind of what communication is. So essentially it's when you are like, and I think one, there are certain things that like on a broader level that we could have communicated clearer what wait times might look like. And I think the state liquor authority makes it very clear you're not hearing back from them anytime soon when you apply for a license. And I think OCM could have kind of been franker about that. I can go into more detail why I think we didn't do that. But I think kind of when it comes to the licensee communication and the applicant communication, specifically for card, but also on a broader level is, okay, when the government speaks, the government has to speak with 100% assured confidence. When the government speaks in things, the government is not a Jedi. We have to be assured. We can't speak in terms of gray, because when you say things that are gray, it opens you up for lawsuits. And I think, like, as we saw, lawsuits slowed so many things down. I think that's a greater conversation about like how litigial our society is. And I don't think that's any individual's fault. But I think when it comes to it is, okay, you get somebody on the phone, you get a civil servant, you get somebody who isn't the person who wrote this policy, who's doing their darndest, and they know if they unequivocally say X, Y, or Z, that could put them in hot water. And this isn't something unique to the Office of Cannabis Management. This is just kind of how government works. I mean, how many people were struggling to collect unemployment benefits in 2020, 2021? There were massive backlogs where literally, I was in a state Senate office. There were a lot of people, the only way they would be able to get unemployment was by calling their local elected official who would be able to back channel directly with these agencies. So I think when it comes to kind of like, we in the modern day expect a certain level of customer service. I think the customer service you get from an Amazon chatbot, or I don't know, like a Seamless or a DoorDash chatbot, and like you get it immediately. And at the end of the day, if the chatbot gives you bad information and information that actually messes with your bag, you can sue them. And these people are totally fine paying out small class action suits on these fronts. But with government, you can't say anything unless you are 100% sure. And I think that's a major flaw and fault with government. I'm not here to say, oh, the way government operates today is good. I got into government because I am deeply frustrated with how government works. And I believe that there are people that if enough people over a sustained period of time are able to kind of put themselves in these positions, you're able to be more responsive. And I mean, I took that on when it came to press responses. I showed up in day one. My goal was for our agency to be 5% more responsive than any other state agency. Very quickly on, I learned how unresponsive every other state agency was to press. Like this idea that you can just sit back and not answer questions. So what wound up happening a lot were a licensee or an applicant would have a question. They would reach out through formal channels. They would get kind of vague government-ease responses because that's what government kind of has to say to protect itself when asked broad questions by an individual. And then they would be frustrated with their lack of answer. They would then go to Brad Racino or Sean Tian at Cannabis Insider, who would then flip a question to me. And then I would immediately either be able to get a background clarification to them that they could tweet out or get a full description or as to full of my ability, or to the best of my ability, a full description of what was going on. And I very much tried to use my role and my position to answer questions. I mean, my number was one of the easier numbers to find. If you were digging, it was on press releases. If you want to reach me now, you probably can still find it on the internet. That is not my cart number. That was at work.
Someone else is answering the phone though.
We'll see. But no, it was, and I would pick up every phone call I got, for better or worse. I mean, somebody once called me and said, you are at the top of the list for the reasons I'm going to kill myself. And it's like not a fun or productive way to communicate. But I picked up the phone every time I got called, or not every single time I got called, but I was picking up the phone. If it rang, I answered. I kind of gave, to the best of my ability, answers to card licensees, general applicants. I was at board meetings talking to folks who had questions or statements in public comment. Others, John on policy was, Chris Alexander very prolifically was kind of staying after events, answering questions, taking notes, seeing what he could sort out, which obviously is not the most efficient way to run government, but kind of a compromise you have to do when you're understaffed, when you don't have the like people on the whole who can kind of deliver. And I think the report, so I have a lot of thoughts on the report. I'll pass it back to Jeremy.
Let me sort of just jump in there. I think as a journalist, I guess I can still sort of call myself that. Like, one of the starkest things about the communications generally, I think, which raised a lot of eyebrows in the broader press and maybe society at large, is promising people without generational wealth that they could have generational wealth in an industry that is federally legal, where capital is scarce, where it's very competitive, both in the regulated market and the unregulated market, right? Like, that is a huge promise. And that's a statement that just deserves a ton of scrutiny, right? And I think I just, just to sort of like finish the question, it's like, are you still optimistic that the card program or the cannabis program more generally can create generational wealth for people?
Oh, I mean, I think it already has started creating generational wealth for people, especially on the retail side. I think the question is, will any of those people be the people who are placed in the DASNY fund built out sites? And I doubt that. I think kind of Ross Adams of the city has reported very well on kind of the terms of these funds, but also like the concept, or not the concept of generational wealth, but I think the way generational wealth is utilized in society today, I want to kind of take a step back. And I think it is language that speaks not to me. It's language that often speaks to Black, Hispanic, non-white communities. My family's generational comfort came from the fact that after my grandfather served in World War II, he was able to come back on the GI Bill, buy a home, get a college degree, and become a high school principal. And through that civil service job, was able to create a comfort that allowed my mom to go to college and me to go to college. And I think when you talk about generational wealth, you're not talking to Aaron Ghitelman, whose grandfather was able to retire and travel the world. You're talking to people who, when their retirement plan is their kids supporting them. And I think in some ways, I don't know if I would say, I think in some ways it makes it tougher, but I also think this is language that came from Black people speaking to Black people. And I think in a way that I can nitpick it, but it was never for me specifically. And not to say that the card program was just for Black people. The card program is deeply, deeply diverse. But I think when you talk about cannabis, and I think to loop it back to what Jeremy said earlier about New York having this kind of sky high equity goals, that happened because New York was ground zero of cannabis prohibition. That Michael Bloomberg put more people in handcuffs for cannabis possession and consumption than any other human ever to live in the history of humanity. I mean, I went to high school during the peak of stop and frisk. And if you were an 18 to 35-year-old Black man in New York at that time, statistically speaking, you were going to get stopped and frisked more than once a year. Literally. And obviously some got stopped and frisked more or less, but I think there's too many conversations about cannabis focus just on profit and not on kind of what came before legalization. And I think we kind of want to forget what came before legalization. Granted, is the best form of reparative justice for the pain of prohibition a licensing program? I know a lot of folks on the left who feel that actually it's the grant program from the Cannabis Advisory Board that is more reparative justice, which is taking money from cannabis revenues and distributing it to community programs. And I think they might have a point, but simultaneously, if you were putting food on the table selling cannabis before legalization, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to do it post-legalization. And that's something New York has done, or New York has tried to do and attempted to do and fought to do in ways very few places have done. When New York legalized sports betting, they didn't go around chatting with bookies saying, hey, how do we create a career for you in this space? Granted, bookies were targeted differently than cannabis consumers and sellers. But I think kind of what New York did was deeply different. And maybe it was a sky-high dream that never was going to be able to be accomplished. But I think if that $200 million that the fund had wasn't a public-private partnership, which was 50 from the state, 150 from private investors, but 200 million from the state that they could have jumped in and started working with immediately, we would be seeing something pretty different.
Okay, so I want to, like, given that context, like, I want to turn to some things in the report and sort of have your response to them. And I'm going to do this sort of as broadly as possible. First, the sort of note in the report that got a lot of airtime was that the OCM underspent its fiscal budget by 26 million. I know you have a perspective on that, so I'd like to hear your perspective. Like, did the OCM underspend its budget? Where was that budget coming from? And what does that, like, explain what that really means?
Yeah, so Senator Liz Krueger, one of the architects of the MRTA, who also, I believe, is the Senate budget chair and knows far more about this subject than I do, noted, I believe, to the New York Times, that this is just what a new agency does. That kind of, it's not that there's money sitting aside, that they were like, we'll punt it till next year. It's literally like when you are growing and scaling, you appropriate X amount, and you might not be able to hit that. And I also think kind of the flip side is some of the worst in government is like the classic DOD line items, where Department of Defense line items, where it's like, oh my God, if our team doesn't spend every single penny, it gets cut next year. But also, I think OCM spends ran through, and hiring specifically ran through the governor's office and the Office of General Services, that OCM could not post a listing without running it through and getting it approved. And sometimes literally the listing would get hit and submitted by the Office of General Services. So I started in March 2022. I got my offer to start in January 2022. One of my colleagues got their offer to start in January 2022. And because of just like a paperwork error on OGS's fault, did not get to start until June. And this is just kind of one instance that gets repeated over and over and over again. And I think so Rich, as a party who worked in the Cuomo administration, has noted, isn't it bizarre that OGS oversaw this assessment instead of the Inspector General? Yeah. The Inspector General would have been able to, literally a position created to do this, would have been able to kind of take this broad view of it and look at all the different players. But OGS kind of came in, and I can't say without a shadow of a doubt that OGS had the ultimate result planned ahead of time. But to me, this was a governor looking for an excuse to remove Chris Alexander, and not a governor who just wanted to actually see all the facts, because she had so many other tools at her disposal she could have used, and instead went with this agency that she was able to politicize and that she was able to control every step of. This wasn't an independent inquiry.
So, okay. So I want to hold that thought, because it's a really good point. In terms of the way, so another key piece of the report, right? Like, in terms of the way the OCM was structured, I think there was some issue around how Alexander had, I believe it was 8 direct reports, most who don't oversee operational areas. I'm sort of like quoting from memory here. From your perspective, like, was that how a new startup policy agency should be structured? Like, were there reporting problems? Were there organizational challenges from inside the agency? Does that ring true to you?
I think so. I think any entity I've ever been in has had kind of issues with growth, be it the nonprofit I was at that went from 5 employees to 25 when I was there, or New York City Census, which I would actually say, which was a deeply, deeply effective effort that actually added, I believe, 1 or 2 state assembly members and 1 state senator to New York City from the rest of the state, because the rest of the state did not do census outreach issues. There were 3 directors at that agency who kind of were fighting these constant turf battles. And at OCM, we were all hired by the same people with the same goal, moving like a school of fish in the same direction. I think like that's not because Chris was like uniquely tight-fisted in his control. It was because we all came on to do the same thing. So I would say there were the growing pains I saw were, okay, certain systems worked very well when there were 45 or 50 people, and then, or really 35 or 40 people. Then when you grow to 150, how do you kind of keep everybody involved? You're doing this spread across 2, if not 3 offices. I'm not sure the status of hiring at the Buffalo office. You're doing this with a mix of people who came over from the Department of Health on the medical program, which I think actually, if you want to talk about New York's rollout, the fact that New York had one of the kind of weakest and thinnest medical programs meant that we would not be able to have that day one transition. Other states did. But I think I think that alone wasn't that much of an issue. I never really felt like it was hard for me to get answers. I think certain things, these are tough questions to answer, but I never felt that the systems I was dealing with were worse than kind of the systems I dealt with in the city, where like everybody was so siloed and like you weren't really talking to other people, and kind of like you were just kind of there, and there was very little cross-team communication. I think OCM very much was, and the governor uses it pejoratively, OGS uses it pejoratively in the report, but referring to a startup culture. Startup culture means you're working harder than just the basic 9 to 5, that you're putting in hours on nights and weekends, and that you're wearing multiple hats. And I think what separates OCM from so many other government entities I've been in is very rarely did somebody say, oh, that's not my purview. Like in a lot of places, it's people in government treat their job as if it's an assembly line. All I do is just kind of nail this one thing in. If that isn't happening, I don't do it. And if somebody asks me to remove a nail, I can't do it. Right. At OCM, it was very kind of dynamic. And that being said, I think, so I think that itself isn't something I'm like, oh, wow. I think you could use aggressive language to describe any organizational structure in ways that make it look bad. Short of Toyota's line management system, which allows for kind of people in every step of the process to have feedback loops, like there's no perfect management system. But to be fair, OCM was significantly flatter than other agencies. So if somebody who was kind of answering phones found an issue, they would have way more direct access to their team's manager, their team's director, than somebody in other wings of government. And I think that's something that the governor's office always found very confusing, that actually we have feedback loops and we're listening to people up and down the process. And they describe pivots and changes as like chaos because they've never been in a place where they're actually listening to somebody below them. All they know is kind of top-down bark orders.
So we're sort of coming on time here. I want to get the questions in that
we could do this all day, but I'm not sure everybody will stick around all day.
Yeah. The last question, like specific question I'll ask you about the report, right? There is this broader sense that I think reading the report that the people reading the applications were also part of creating the policy, right? And there was a clear perspective that they had. This is alleged in the report. This is alleged in the press, not even really by me, but in the broader press. How do you sort of respond to that question that was there a conflict of interest? Was there not a conflict of interest? No. Is this different than other agencies? Yeah.
So I think there were certain aspects of the license review process I did not have visibility into. Sure. But I think the question of were there conflicts of interest, I'm not really sure what that is. All these applications were cut and dry. They're compliant or they're not compliant. And I think that actually leads to what was not in the report. And I think this is important to note. They went in with the idea that they were going to find corruption, malfeasance, favoritism, and retaliation. Literally, Damian Fagan, the chief equity officer, was suspended for an accusation of that. There was none of that in the report. My understanding is they brought in somebody from the MTA's corruption unit who kind of poked around for 2 full weeks talking to everybody they could, and they found none of that. That's what they were looking for when they initially did it. And it's like, Obviously, you're going to find inefficiencies in how government operates. You're going to find them in the SLA. You're going to find them in the DMV. You're going to find them in the city clerk marriage office.
Not the DMV. How dare you?
Yeah.
And I think kind of when you look at that, it's like they didn't find that malfeasance. They did not find these accusations that have been lobbed over and over again. And believe me, they were looking for it. There was no like, oh, hope, because at the end of the day, I think it was a political decision. The governor in 2021 felt appointing somebody who had strong equity bona fides and racial justice bona fides was politically salient and valuable at that moment. And the governor has moved a step or two to the right, as a lot of political actors have, as kind of the marches of 2020 have fallen into the history books and memory, that the governor thought, okay, maybe equity is something I'll play with, and then threw that doll away when she felt it was no longer politically expedient, and she was more interested in winning the votes of Republicans and people who aren't, and not to say Republicans are not in favor of cannabis legalization, a whole lot of them are, but when she decided that she actually wanted the more conservative voters, and that actually the people that might be more liberal than me or more left than me don't matter. And I think that's what happened, where the governor doesn't have this grand vision of what she wants to do in New York State, like even Andrew Cuomo had, who kind of viewed himself as a master builder and was willing to kind of work with people and like sometimes bully people, but work with people in a lot of ways to get things done. So Jay, you're not in New York State, but Governor Hochul doesn't have crowning achievements. She doesn't have big things she's fighting for. So if you're not fighting for big things, why deal with the headache of supporting an agency that's trying to do big, tough, complicated things? Something she didn't do. Like, if this report, God, I wish this report came out in 2023. God, I wish the governor said, I am committing more resources. I am kind of really taking this seriously. And I think the difference is the governor didn't care about the farmers. The governor didn't care about the card licensees. But for the first time, we have applicants who have the capital to hire expensive lobbyists, who have the ability to kind of beat it over the head for the governor that, hey, people are angry, people are upset. And like, I'm not saying people weren't upset. They didn't have to make that up. But it's very interesting to see that what made the governor move. It wasn't struggling farmers across the state. It wasn't justice evolved licensees. It was the max donors and the lobbyists who are telling her, hey, now something's wrong. And if the governor had listened to us in 2022 when we talked about enforcement, we'd be in a whole different situation today.
I want to let our viewers go, and I want to follow up this conversation because I have many, many more questions, and I appreciate your perspective, Aaron. To wrap it up, right? Do you think, I'll ask the point blank question. Do you think Alexander was a fall guy? Do you think he should have been replaced? Or do you think, he is sort of, being made to blame for everything that has gone on here?
Oh, yeah, they very much, I think the governor's pinning this on him. I mean, I think a greater question is, would Chris want to do this another 3-year term with a governor who doesn't support him and a governor who has thrown him under the bus at pretty much seemingly every possible opportunity this calendar year? So no, I don't think that. I think at the end of the day, I mean, every state seemingly replaces the person who sets up these agencies. Maybe there's some state where somebody's been able to sit there for 8 to 10 years. But yeah, this was kind of inevitable. I think in certain ways it would have been very interesting if the governor said more about DASNY and kind of cared that DASNY didn't do what they said they were going to do. But yeah, I think the governor wants to kind of shift blame. And I think what's so frustrating to me is there's an entirely different story the governor could have told. The governor could have seen, I mean, New York went from 25 or 30 dispensaries open in December to over 100 2 or 3 months later. A number still growing rapidly. The governor could have said, this is incredible. The momentum's here. The market is working. Cultivators are able to sell their products. Processors are able to sell their products. Consumers are finally able to kind of have easier access. This is incredible. This is awesome. Like, I always knew this would work. And like, we had growing pains, but it's turned around. But it's interesting that the governor, who is willing to kind of defend judicial appointees who don't have the votes until that ship has sunk and that she has burned all of her political capital, decides actually it's the young black agency head who needs to kind of get thrown by the wayside.
Follow that up. What should the next leader of the OCM know? Like, what type of person should run the agency, and how can you, looking on the outside, prepare them for success?
Yeah, I mean, have a thick skin. Don't look at the Twitter comments. But I think kind of beyond that, it's be adaptable. Don't come in with a kind of ironclad, this is what's going to happen, this is what I'm going to do. I think you got to kind of come in, be flexible, understand that. And I think they're going to have a really tough situation where I imagine there's going to be significant departures from not just people who were public facing that you're aware of, but people up and down the org chart at OCM who it's, why would I continue doing this for a governor who is trashing me in the press? And I think the governor now says, oh, it's not the agency's members' fault. But go back to January or early February, she said, these people need to work harder. This is a disaster. What are they doing? And that was a direct attack on these workers of her state. And I think we saw a lot of people take pay cuts to come and work in government because they believe in this and are interested in this. And at the end of the day, if you're not able to kind of do big things and the governor doesn't support it, you're going to see a lot of loss. And I think it'll be important for whoever comes next to not let the equity program, the social and economic equity team, fall by the wayside. Because CARD wasn't the be all and end all in equity. There's the Cannabis Compliance Training and Mentorship Program that has brought in some of the best cannabis cultivators in the world into New York's legal market. There are accelerator programs. There are incubator programs. There's a whole lot that people have been working on that I am terrified will kind of go away. And I think to kind of bring it to what maybe another question is, I'm deeply bullish on New York's market. I think the kind of framework of a two-tier market, of a true antitrust, anti-monopolization, anti-cartel market means it will thrive. I think New York is very quickly becoming a cannabis capital of the world. I mean, it might be frustrating for the tennis players, but boy, what a great advertisement to come to a trip to New York, that every year during the US Open, a tennis player blames the pot smoke from a nearby park for their loss. It's a reminder that for the 22-year-old who a decade ago would have gone to Amsterdam, New Amsterdam's right here.
Even old New York was once New Amsterdam.
Aaron, we really appreciate your candor. There's a lot of questions we haven't gotten to, a whole philosophical discussion that we talked about we wanted to get to. We haven't, so we'll have to have you back on. But appreciate you answering the questions and really appreciate the insight into the inner workings of your time at the OCM.
I loved it. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Jeremy. And stay on for 2 seconds as we wrap. That is it for today's Cultivated Live. We encourage you to subscribe to our daily newsletter at cultivated.news. Follow us on LinkedIn. Smash the subscribe button. Jeremy's wearing the shirt. Tomorrow, we have a slight change of program. Usually on Thursdays, we have Krista Raymer. She's going to join us on Friday because tomorrow we have John Levine, the CEO of MariMed. He's going to be joining us, which is great. He'll be on live at 10 a.m. Eastern. All the same channels. Remember, and this is for you, Aaron, buy cannabis at your local dispensary. That's how we end every show. So Wednesday's a great day to buy weed for sure. So we will see everybody later. Find Aaron on X. You can see his title right there at Ghitelman. Easy peasy. Find us on all those channels as well. Thanks, everybody. We will see everybody tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern.